That's right. That is right, beautiful community. You've missed me so much, and you've cried every night for the 5 or 6 days that I've been away. So you're yeah. You're very, very welcome back to our conversation. 10-minute conversation, I reckon, today. A kind of reorientation that grounds us in what? Let's call it in dilemmas Putin faces, but we'll make a couple of interesting points, I think, that grasp the way things are beyond the frivolity of some of the public discourse we often float in. Now, I've been away for a few days because I had a reaction to a medication. And, we've got a lot of people in this community, and some of you I know have health challenges, and I want to send my love to you and acknowledge you. In the chronic illness community, if it is a community, this problem of people not being able to tolerate medications that help them is a very, very big problem. And it's an enormously challenging and frustrating problem. And the main manifestation of it is, of course, that you can see with a particular individual that and this helps them, but they just can't tolerate it because their body reacts to it so much that it becomes counterproductive for them to take it. And of course, there is this then further consequence that people in that position feel. And that is, well, what if something significant went wrong with my health that's less expected, and then suddenly one's in the hospital and one urgently needs medical interventions to which one will have bad reactions and which one might not tolerate. That's a sort of a perennial sort of slippery slope challenge that people in the chronic illness community often experience, and these reactions evoke very understandably feelings of being in a kind of violent and unsafe place. So if any of you are going through anything like that, and I know, we've got 100,000 folks who return here to the chat channel, 200,000 who return to the main channel. Some of you are going through stuff like that. So today I want to take the opportunity to send my love your way and tell you that I see you. Now, let's begin orientating ourselves, and we'll say something about Putin's dilemmas. Imaginative self-extraction in politics is hugely important. If the other guy, the other gal, who is your enemy, is not seeing things the way you are seeing them, you got to be able to see it the way they see it to understand what you need to do next. We have been involved in a conversation, we in the West, about how far Ukraine's counteroffensive fell short of expectations. It failed, it relatively failed, it wasn't given the opportunity to succeed. 77 other summaries of what took place over the last few months. But the theme is the underperformance relative to some expectations, not all expectations, some expectations of Ukraine's counteroffensive. Ukraine's counteroffensive didn't go as well as people had hoped. That's the narrative for us. That is not the narrative for Putin. And it's not the Chinese narrative either. So let's be absolutely clear about doing this correct imaginative self-extraction. Putin's narrative, if what I've just given us is a cartoonish summary of our narrative, Putin's narrative is the West's commitment to Ukraine has not yielded the goals it sought to attain. Western weakness. And then a further exposure of the reality that the West's talk, and this is the penultimate video in the main channel, the West's talk of a global order is increasingly talk about a world that's no longer there. The West is doing all kinds of things, it's staying afloat in various kinds of ways, but there is no world order that the West sits atop or supervises. Western weakness, the West trying to do something and failing, right? Ukraine's not even part of that narrative. Ukraine didn't succeed, didn't fail in anything for Putin. It's Western commitment falling short of what it tried to achieve. The West trying to do something, but not being able to. All-powerful West, is it? All-powerful West? No. Right? So it's very important to understand that that's how the Chinese will see this. That's how Putin sees this. What is Putin's position? Putin is going to participate in an extraordinary ritual, which we will define and describe, of a kind of fake election whose fakeness is real. As I put it in a note, it's a ritual about appearances which affects reality. We won't talk about it now because we'll have separate conversations about it. At the moment, I describe Putin's situation as stabilization paired with anxiety and uncertainty. The front looks relatively stable, right? We want to put a very low confidence on that because I'm not a military expert. The regime looks relatively stable. The economy looks relatively stable. Institutions that you could call institutions that are part of the state more than they're part of the regime look relatively stable. This could change at any moment, but the imminent threats to the regime's and the state's capacity to go on do not seem to be there, as much as everybody in the Kremlin was terrified by Prigozhin's mutiny. Now, that doesn't mean that the regime isn't stressed by the ongoing war. It's stressed in all kinds of ways, right? And the most straightforward thing we can notice is just the Russian military, right? The Russian military is not being properly rotated. Yeah. They're not fighting in good conditions. They have very low morale and have no clear understanding of what the hell it is that they're fighting for. That is not enormously healthy, right? That is not enormously, I don't want to say enormously sustainable. It could be sustainable for a very long time, but it's a situation that carries risk, especially with this issue of Putin being fearful to rotate. So one of the things that we've got to admit is that, yes, of course, Ukraine doesn't want a war that lasts years. Well, Ukraine wants the war for years, possibly, if that means getting things out of it, that strengthen its territorial integrity, that are actually meaningful acquisitions. Ukraine doesn't want a war for war's sake. But there is often the argument out there that Putin wants war for war's sake, and you've got to be clear about that. It's true and it isn't true. It's true in the sense that Putin is increasingly committed, not just at the level of belief, but at the level of institutional restructuring, the restructuring of the education system, the restructuring of the economy. We've discussed this several times on the main channel. Putin is increasingly committed not just to a long-distance war, but to a dramatic escalation against the West, which he doesn't know what form it might take, and which may or may not be feasible, because he wouldn't want to dramatically escalate against the West unless he feels some measure of confidence that the West will run away from the challenge. And so far, at least in some significant respects, the West hasn't run away from the challenge in Ukraine. It's perhaps not faced the challenge with strategic clarity, but it's not completely run away from it. So in this sense, Putin is after a long war. But if you said to Putin, we can have a break of a few years so that you can then restart, would you like that? He would say, yes, I'd love that. Which is to say that he's committed to the long-term conflict, but he is not in love with the idea of perpetuating a war for years, which is always a source of unpredictable consequences, unpredictable impact, and will inevitably force him, if it goes on, into further mobilization. I don't just mean political mobilization, I mean military mobilization too. He's going to need to rotate the fighting force more than he's doing now, and the efforts, this is my political analysis, the efforts of the regime to keep a low-level invisible mobilization going that is enough to sustain a long-term war aren't succeeding. So they're going to be forced into a dilemma of being very scared about doing, but possibly needing to do, a mobilization that is much more intense and much more visible. Now, they know the population has rather calmed down from the original mobilization in September 2022, but they're worried about how the population will react. One of the stabilizing factors, in fact, has been this non-rotation of the Russian fighting force, because people are feeling, well, these folks have been captured, but now that they've been captured, they're kind of there, and we can deal with that as long as the circle doesn't keep widening. And if there is a perception of this circle widening, especially widening by catching people who are more resistant to being caught than people who have so far been caught, well, that could be a problem, and that could be a threat to the regime's stability, with some unforeseeable consequences. That's at least a worry that the regime has. So that's where we are so far. We've mentioned this point about self-extraction, around how the Russians see Ukraine's counteroffensive. They see it as the West showing weakness. We've talked about the relative stabilization of the Putin regime, but accompanied with various fears and concerns, and a relatively imminent prospect of lose-lose decisions. And we've mentioned the way in which Putin wants a protracted war and the way in which Putin doesn't. So let's say a couple of more quick cartoonish things. One thing that's absolutely collapsed for Putin, and he recognizes that, is of course the idea of any kind of a quick victory. I think what's collapsed for us in the West is the idea that us backing Ukraine, let us say, half of the way, will be enough to make Putin go away, will be enough to break Putin, break the Putin regime, or break his commitment to escalation. That hasn't happened. And so that means that he knows that there's no quick victory around the corner for him, or even in the medium term for him. But the fact that Western hopes of a quick asphyxiation of the Putin regime have not materialized too, that means that Putin is hoping that down the line, opportunities for victory arise for him that are and will remain out of reach for the next year or two. And these opportunities are all to do with an escalation against the West, right? He's engaged, he's originally engaged in the regime change coup or war in Ukraine, whose purpose is functional, overwhelmingly functional. There's also various stories about how Ukraine isn't real and Ukraine isn't anything but a bit of Russia that's forgotten it's Russian. But the preponderance of the motivation is about a gambit against the West that provokes the West into retreat, leading to a rearrangement of the international order, or the international disorder, as we might call it. So Putin feels that his hopes for a marginal victory have grown. His hopes for a long-term victory have marginally grown. I mean, if this is a boxing match, what we'd say is that Putin's losing. It's about round 5, and you've got 12 rounds. Putin's losing by a significant margin, but he's won the last round. And he knows that he feels that there is some reason to suspect that his opponent will gas out rounds 10 to 12, and that at that point, if he gets there, he will be able to make enough of an impact and compensate for his being behind on points for the majority of the fight. That's how I'd describe it. What's hard about all of these descriptions is that different conceptions of victory, different conceptions of success are floating about. But as far as the Putin regime is concerned, what we're looking at always, right, has to start with these two interconnected motivations for war, which is regime security and somehow overturning whatever is the latest shape of the international order and thrusting Russia from row 3 or 4 to the front row of the story of global power relations. And that he absolutely hasn't done. He hasn't done regime change in Ukraine. He has expanded NATO. He has instigated a degree of consolidation in the West. The trouble, of course, is that the West is committed to Ukraine's survival and committed to a non-escalation of the war, but it's not committed to Ukrainian victory. And that allows Putin to keep playing even when he's behind on points, hoping he can make a comeback later down the line. So he is thinking about rounds 11 through to 12, and he feels that it's not very pretty that he's behind on points by a significant margin in round 5, but he thinks that his odds of coming out on top are real. I might put them into the low double figures. He might put them into something like a probability, a likelihood. But that these are delusions of grandeur to some extent, based in reality, but an exaggerated take on it. Now, I'm grateful you've been with me. This has been a real pleasure for me to be reconnected with you. As you can see, I'm dealing with a few challenges, so this was a little bit slow and rambly. But we're back, and I think the next thing we're going to do, probably tomorrow, the day after, is a very, very, very long-form Q&A on the chat channel here. Lots of love till then.